I'm in Winston Heights and I want to do a little video on stormwater. So recently I did a video on how to set trees up to die, and today I want to talk a little bit about how to set trees up for success. Now I'm actually right next to Nose Creek. I'm at the top of the hill, and so if I pan down there, it's kind of tough to see with this small camera on here, but there's a creek right beside that golf course right there. And it's really degraded. It's getting incised. It gets an enormous amount of stormwater runoff from these types of roads all over the city. And so what these roads do is they set up a really interesting hydrograph in that when the rain comes, the water instantly leaves the road as fast as possible, and as opposed to how it would naturally work, which is the rain would come, it would get infiltrated into the soil, and it might take up to 40 years for water to get into that creek. And so what you end up with when it rains is you end up with really large events entering into the creek really quickly, and then no water afterwards. So you get really high flows and really low flows. And that makes it really difficult for fish to survive. It makes it really difficult for wildlife to be able to get water when they need it. And it also just generally starts to desertify our cities. And so cities are actually desertification elements. You see, every element in the landscape is either going to harvest water or it's going to shed water. There's no real middle ground there. And so roads would definitely be water harvesting elements, which doesn't make them inherently evil or destructive. It just means that we have to pattern them in the right way. And so when we do not pattern roads in the right way, interesting things start to happen. So as you can see, there's a road behind me. There's all these cars that are driving by. We've got a bit of a naturalized space behind me. And there's a whole bunch of weeds growing in there. I'm not going to get into weeds or invasive weeds in this episode. Maybe that's a future conversation. But right down there, right behind me, and again, it's tough to see if I can get a close up here. There's actually a head cut, okay, which is a pretty good sign, and we can see more evidence of it here behind me, that there's an enormous amount of flow coming off of this road and entering right there. There's tons and tons of signs of erosion right below my feet here. Let's see if I can cross this without ending up in the Darwin Awards. So a whole bunch of the water is actually shedding off of this road right behind me, and it ends up going over the side there, which is why we end up with head cuts. Now, head cuts are kind of like unzipping the landscape, and as you start to cut deeper into the landscape, it starts to eliminate groundwater. So it's kind of equivalent to cutting yourself and just letting yourself bleed out. So as the head cut gets deeper, groundwater bleeds into the head cut, which lowers the groundwater table, and then all the trees around it start to die, which increases the evaporation from the reduction of shade, and the system just kind of unwinds and goes down and ends up in desert. Now, one of the reasons that our creeks and streams are struggling so much is the element right below me right here. And so this is a storm sewer. Now, storm sewers are different in every city, but generally speaking, the way that storm sewers work is that the curbs, which you can see right beside where I'm walking, are set up to funnel water into these storm drains. These storm drains then send it out to the local streams or creeks or rills within the city to get the water away as quickly as possible. So like I said earlier, this does a couple of things. Number one, it sets up a really unhealthy torrent of water, or unhealthy hydrograph, in that we get very large torrents of water going into our streams and creeks. It creates head cuts. But in addition to that, because of all the vehicles on our roads, we end up with all sorts of asbestos, lead, PCBs, motor oil, basically all the crap coming off of our cars, specifically the parts that are wearing down like brakes, but also all the chemicals that result in the combustion of diesel and fossil fuel end up in our stormwater. And so these things also end up into our creeks and streams. And ultimately, if your city is like Calgary, you end up with that stuff entering into the drinking water system. And while we have all sorts of filters and devices to clean up that water, it'd be better if it just wasn't there in the first place. Because some of it's going to get through, which means that you and I are going to end up drinking the very stuff that we're unconsciously putting in to our water system. And so, as with most of my conversations, there's got to be a solution to this stuff. Let's see if I can keep the sun behind my head there. Sorry about that. And so the solution is actually to use biology. So Paul Stamets has done a ton of work on, you know, cleaning up hydrocarbons with mushrooms. It turns out that a lot of mycelium is really good for cleaning up or accumulating heavy metals. And so biology is the ultimate cleaner of the environment. It takes CO2 and turns it into sugar. It takes hydrocarbons and turns it into mushrooms. It accumulates heavy metals. Trees can accumulate heavy metals. And so the goal is to use the stormwater as an opportunity as opposed to always looking at it as a liability. And so we can turn liabilities into resources if we just think a little bit more creatively about what to do with the resource that we call stormwater. So this whole road behind me is actually sloping towards the end of this cul-de-sac, which I'm walking towards. And this is one of the best examples of a rain garden here in Calgary that I've found. And so I really applaud the city of Calgary for starting to work with these systems. Let's get the sun out of your eyes, guys. Put it into mine so that I can squint. And so what we've got here is a pretty incredible little stormwater system that is filtering and cleaning the stormwater before it ends up in the storm drain. Now, that's the entrance or the inlet of the stormwater pond that I'm going to take you into. And you can see that there's some erosion there. It's definitely picking up topsoil. You can see the lip of the lawn over there is getting taller and taller. And so the water flows off of this street right here and enters into this storm drain or storm pond. And so I'll just take you guys through it here. So the water moves through this grassed swale or diversion drain. And I was here a couple of years ago, and I can tell you right now that the storm pond is just going off. So let's just have a look from the other side. The water flows down this little sloped gravel area. And these trees are going off. Now, they're not being irrigated by the city. Okay, we've got a little bit of a mulch collection and debris collection with all of these forester grasses right here, these thick clumps of grass. So you can see there's lots of water flowing through here just based on the debris that's being picked up. Okay. And the plants are just going off. I'm gonna walk by some. And so these are all being passively irrigated with stormwater, and guess what they're picking up as well? Exactly, pollutants. So heavy metals. They're also creating incredible habitat. So they're creating an island of habitat in the middle of the city. They're creating oxygen, so they're cleaning the air for us. My only criticism of this space, and I think that the reason they did this was because this is a test plot, but the system itself was pretty expensive to put in because it's a little bit over-engineered. So I know for a fact that this system has a through drain, which means it's got a giant culvert in the bottom. And that through drain is there to pick up any water that infiltrates into the system through the mulch layer, through the plant. So basically, all it does is essentially slow the water down before it drains back into the storm sewer. They also have these really interesting overflows in them right here. So if the water ever gets too high in the system, it's got somewhere to go. So the main design criteria here was to take stormwater, run it through a living sponge, a biological sponge, hopefully clean it up a little bit, and then as it gets saturated and full of liquid, it would get picked up in a through drain that runs underneath the entire rain garden itself. This is one of the best parts of the rain garden right here, is the educational piece. So the City of Calgary has done a great job explaining how this system works. I'll just give you a closer look at it, and I think you can see this online as well. So there's the basin right there that they're talking about, with all the media and all the plants on the top. And then you can see what I was talking about. There's a through drain, so the water gets picked up at the bottom and it will still end up in our streams and creeks. Now I think that's great in the sense that they're returning the water back to a flowing water body, and they're basically slowing it down to change that hydrograph, which is what we were talking about initially. The thing is that nature will do this on its own without through drains. So water will essentially percolate through at its own pace, and it might take, like I said, 40 years to get there as opposed to 3 weeks, which is what this system might allow for. And so I think there's opportunities to use these rain gardens to grow street trees, to reduce the albedo or the absorptivity of the city. I mean, there's some people who don't necessarily buy into the whole climate argument that say that the primary driver of increased observed temperatures with climate change is mostly due to the urban heat island effects. And while I can't say whether that is true or not, because I haven't studied the science enough, what I can say is that there's no question that covering green spaces with blacktop and concrete, putting roofs on our houses that are dark or black, is absolutely going to have an impact as to how sun interacts with the planet. And I guarantee it's going to change the thermodynamics of the planet. You can't not do that. I mean, you can't not change the thermodynamics of the planet if you don't change the surface coloring of it. So all of these streets, I mean, in Calgary here we get about 300 millimeters of rain, or about 10 inches, maybe 11 inches a year. All of these streets have the ability to take our 300 millimeter or 10-inch year of rainfall and turn it into 1,000 millimeters, a meter, or 3 feet of rain, if we just figure out how to pattern our streets to harvest rainwater using rain gardens. And I think we can do it in very simple ways. If you want to see one of the innovators in this space and what they do, Brad Lancaster, who wrote Water Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, an incredible set of books, highly recommend it. I'll make sure I put a link to his stuff in the show notes below. Has been putting storm drains and rain gardens, removing storm drains and putting rain gardens all over Tucson, Arizona, with incredible success. And so if you're ever in Tucson, go check out some of the work that he's done. I highly recommend his books, and also check out his website, harvestingrainwater.com. I'll make sure I put that in the show notes below as well. We can totally change the albedo. We can increase the livability of our cities. We can increase habitat for birds, bees, and insects. We can increase the amount of food that we grow. One of the interesting things that Brad discovered through working through a local university in Tucson was that the street trees they were planting in these rain gardens actually were picking up the heavy metals, picking up the nasty stuff in the stormwater, which is great because it's not getting into the river, but they actually planted edibles into these spaces. And what's crazy about that is they then tested, I think it was specifically mesquite pods. They tested the mesquite pods after they'd grown with all the stormwater, and it turned out that the mesquite trees were not hyper-accumulating these nasty materials in the pods themselves. So the trees were holding on to the nasty stuff, the food was not. And so this type of research has to happen in all of the cities that are going to take it on. And we've got to start cleaning up the messes that we've created. We've got to start managing the liabilities and turning them into opportunities to deal with things like food security, climate change, desertification, and all of the other social and environmental and economic issues that we've created in the way that we've patterned our cities right now. There's totally solutions out there. They don't have to be ridiculously expensive. There are definitely technical challenges along the way, but I think we just have to get on with it. And we've just got to start working towards these things. Otherwise, we're going to wake up one day and the places that had the most soil and the most water and the most fertility are going to be the places that have the least water and the least soil and the least fertility. They're going to be the most food insecure. And we're going to wake up and ask ourselves what happened. We've been running the same pattern for close to 12,000 years, which is deforest, plow, and desertify. And it's time to start changing that pattern. It's time to start changing the conversation to one that is positive and one that talks about how humans can be just as positive as we are negative. So if the most destructive thing out there is the nuclear bomb, then what's the most positive? So make sure you talk to your local municipality about rain gardens and managing stormwater in a creative way. If you do live in Calgary, make sure that you give your local alderperson a phone call and tell them how much you appreciate their work on building these rain gardens and stopping systems like this. Even nature is trying to stop the storm drains through the collection of debris. And all it's doing is trying to pattern after the beaver to try and slow the drainage of water so that it can establish biology back on Mother Earth, the ultimate solar collector. So if you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe below. Check out our website at vergepermaculture.ca. If you want to learn how to design rain gardens, check out our permaculture design course. You can find it on the course section of our website. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Hope you found this interesting.